Yo, what's going on, everybody? So it has been a while since I've sat down and I've made a longer video like this using something like a PowerPoint presentation. These videos obviously take me quite a bit longer to make and write everything up and everything, but these are the types of videos that I really enjoy making, the ones that are quite a bit longer and they're kind of filled with more information than like a 10 or 15-minute video would be. So I think that this is kind of like the true value of longer videos like this, is that there's a lot more information in there. So if you have the time, obviously these videos are going to be quite a bit more beneficial than some of the shorter ones that I make. Anyways, today's topic, we're going to be talking about keeping your metabolism fast while you're dieting. And that's kind of a clickbaity title. What I guess more of an accurate way to talk about things would be to mitigate the metabolic adaptations that our body goes through from a prolonged caloric deficit. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to talk about all of the changes, both physiological and hormonal, that your body will go through over the course of a caloric deficit, specifically a pretty aggressive caloric deficit, kind of referring to things into the context of a contest prep here for competition bodybuilders, both male and female. And we're going to talk about all of the changes that your body goes through during that phase. And then once we understand those changes, that's going to kind of help us give us an idea of how we can combat those and help make the process a little bit easier. Because anybody who's been through a pretty aggressive diet or a contest prep knows that there comes a certain point in which your body is fighting you. And I think if you have a better understanding of what is going on during that time period, it's going to help you be able to overcome the obstacle a little bit easier and help kind of pinpoint the problem, and then be able to surpass it and then make new strides in your conditioning. All right, so first things first, we need to understand the metabolic adaptations. So the big picture that we need to understand is that our body is constantly going to be fighting to maintain homeostasis. So if you haven't taken like any high school or college level biology courses, homeostasis just kind of refers to a state of equilibrium in our body, in which our body isn't really stressed to do one thing or to do another. It's just kind of chilling out and it's just kind of hanging in there. So our body is going to constantly be fighting to maintain homeostasis. And obviously, if we're going through the process of a caloric deficit or a contest prep, especially one that's very aggressive, that's going to be kind of fighting an uphill battle for our body. Our body doesn't really want to be going through that process. And especially as we get leaner and leaner and leaner and the deficit gets more and more and more aggressive, our body is really going to fight against us. And it's going to fight against us in a couple different ways. We're going to be able to talk about all of those as we go forward with this video. But we just kind of need to understand that big picture, is that our body does not very willingly give up our energy reserves or our body fat storages. And we are going to have to kind of fight an uphill battle in order to get the body fat off, especially the last couple pounds before you step on stage. So again, by understanding what these changes are and why they occur, we can kind of plan for them and then potentially counter them. If we know that our body is going to do this and this and this, we can kind of set up a plan so that we can overcome the changes that it's going to make as they occur. And by countering these adaptations and minimizing their effects, we can make a diet easier, more successful, more predictable, and less stressful. So I know the very first time that you probably go through a diet and you hit a fat loss plateau, you're probably wondering, like, why is this happening? Like, I'm doing the math, I'm crunching the numbers, I'm in a caloric deficit, blah blah blah, but nothing is happening. And that's a very stressful situation to be in, especially if you're dieting for a competition and you have a date. Like, you have to be super physiologically lean by a certain date. If you have any time during the course of that contest prep in which you're not really making any progress, not only is that really stressful on you mentally and emotionally, it can potentially cause you to make some pretty rash decisions that could affect your contest prep for the worst, instead of just kind of taking a more smart and logical approach. So first things first, we're going to talk about the hormonal changes that are caused by a prolonged dieting phase. Now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, there we have a couple different types of areas in which we're going to focus on in terms of our body making changes during a caloric deficit. I'm going to be talking first here about the hormonal changes, and then we're going to go into some of the physiological changes, like what does your body actually physically do in order to kind of slow down your metabolism. So some of the hormonal changes that we see now, obviously there are many that we can see, especially if you're getting your blood work done pre and post competition. But the main ones that we're going to talk about in terms of how they influence your metabolism and the ability to oxidize fat are going to be the ones that we talk about here. So the first thing that you're going to notice in a prolonged caloric deficit is your leptin is going to increase. Now, leptin is what we refer to as the hunger hormone. And what leptin is it's kind of a direct ratio of how hungry you are. So the higher your leptin, the hungrier you're going to be. The lower your leptin, or kind of the more like stable that your leptin levels are, the less hungry you're going to be. So again, this is the hunger hormone. This is a hormone that controls your feelings of hunger, your cravings, and all of those kinds of things. And we're also going to see alongside with that a decrease in ghrelin. Now, ghrelin is the satiety hormone. Now, the ghrelin that's in your body is going to determine how satiated you feel or how unsatiated you feel after and during you eat a meal. So we're going to see a decrease in ghrelin. So by having less ghrelin, after we eat a meal, we are not going to be satisfied from that meal. We're going to still feel hungry after the meal. So you can see how leptin and ghrelin go together hand in hand. If you have high amounts of leptin and you're going to constantly be hungry throughout the day, and if your ghrelin levels are low, you're never really going to feel satiated. So you're going to feel hungry all day, and then when you finally do get to sit down and eat after that meal, you're not going to be satisfied. You're going to be sitting there, you're going to be wondering, like, I still need to eat more. I'm still hungry. But you can't eat more because you're in a contest prep and you're in a caloric deficit. So you need to be able to mentally overcome this. Now, obviously, the increase in leptin and the decrease in ghrelin is one of the things that a lot of people who are, I guess, for lack of a better word, they're not very mentally strong. This is where people, especially first-time competitors or first-time dieters, they tend to fall off the wagon, is they can't mentally and emotionally deal with the feelings of hunger. And not specifically just being hungry, but being hungry 24/7. Because you have to understand that if your ghrelin levels are low, you're never really going to feel satiated. It's one thing to be hungry and then eat a meal and then feel satisfied and satiated, and then you can go about your day after that. But if your ghrelin levels are low, you're going to eat and you're going to walk away from your meal thinking, I am still starving. Like, I am not satiated from that meal. So these two things go hand in hand together, and they make dieting. Obviously, this is a hormonal change, but this is also something that is more of a mental struggle, is being able to accept the fact that you are going to be hungry 24/7. And that is something that you need to find ways to deal with and kind of be able to cope with in order for the diet to be successful. I don't really want to go into hunger coping mechanisms too much in this video. I kind of want to focus more on the hormonal and physiological changes. I may talk about ways to deal with hunger in a future video, but for now, just try and stay on track. You're going to see increases in cortisol, and cortisol is your body's stress hormone. Now, there are a lot of negative things that cortisol provides to the body. There, you can obviously Google those and look those up, but you have to understand that cortisol, especially in the physique competitor community, is kind of seen as like a very detrimental hormone to your progress. And so we want to keep our cortisol levels as low as we possibly can to kind of minimize the stress that our body is going through. Cortisol is also a catabolic hormone, so by taking that at surface level, cortisol has the ability to catabolize muscle tissue and free form amino acids, which obviously, if you're dieting, you do not want to be burning up your muscle mass. So we need to be able to keep the cortisol in check. And then finally, the big one is the decreased conversion of thyroxine to triiodothyronine. So those are some pretty big fancy terms. Thyroxine, we have to understand, is T4, and triiodothyronine is T3. That's how I'm going to be referring to these as we go on. So T4 is the total amount of thyroid hormone that we have in our body, and then T3 is the active form of thyroid. So how much of that T4 is actually being utilized in order to keep our thyroid operating optimally and keep our body burning fat, okay? So how do we fix these negative hormonal adaptations? So believe it or not, all of the hormonal adaptations that I just talked about, they can be mediated and kind of alleviated temporarily by having frequent carbohydrate-focused refeeds or potentially diet breaks. I don't want to make this video too much of how to structure a refeed or why you should refeed, when you should refeed. That's kind of a different video for a different day. But specifically leptin and ghrelin, those are what we call carbohydrate-sensitive hormones. So if you want to get rid of kind of the leptin and ghrelin issues, those specific hormones are pretty sensitive to insulin and carbohydrates specifically. And so by overfeeding on carbohydrates, we can kind of bring our leptin back down and increase our ghrelin levels to kind of keep that hormone and that hunger panel just a little bit more favored towards keeping us on track in the diet. And obviously, since these hormones are very sensitive on insulin, they're going to be a lot more sensitive to carbohydrates than they would be to protein and fat, which obviously is why our carbohydrate refeed is centered around carbohydrates, and why I'm not so much of an advocate of cheat meals, which are going to be higher in fat on a contest prep scenario. But again, that's a different video for a different day. So if you remember what I talked about in the last slide, T4 is the total amount of thyroid hormone that we have in our body, and T3 is the active form of thyroid. So our body has to convert that T4 to T3, and that's kind of where the issues come with being in a prolonged diet. Is it's not that we necessarily lose efficiency of the thyroid, or that our thyroid hormones they stop secreting thyroid. It's that the conversion of the T4 to the T3 is heavily slowed down. Now, what we know, if we kind of look at biology and anatomy and all those kinds of things, is that the conversion of T4 to T3 is heavily reliant on your leptin signaling. So if your leptin is abnormally high, then this conversion is going to be affected and it's going to be slowed down. So you can see by having a refeed, we're going to increase our leptin signaling, which will therefore increase the conversion of T4 to T3, which will therefore increase our metabolism and increase our basal metabolic rate. So by giving yourself enough time during your diet, whether it's a contest prep or you're just dieting for the beach, giving yourself enough time where you can afford to every once in a while take a carbohydrate focused refeed to kind of help reset your hormones is going to be extremely beneficial for you in the long run. It would be much more beneficial for you to do a 12-week diet where you can take carbohydrate focused refeeds every 3 weeks or so than to take an 8-week diet or a 10-week diet where you don't take any refeeds at all. I think that's one thing that they don't like to refeed because they feel like it sets them back. But if you give yourself enough time over the course of the diet, then having a refeed isn't really going to set you back. If anything, it's going to be a situation where you're taking one step backwards to be able to take 2 steps forward. The final thing that you can do to keep your thyroid healthy is by making sure that the necessary micronutrients and minerals are available in your diet. Those 3 specifically are going to be iodine, selenium, and tyrosine. Now, first things first, tyrosine is an amino acid. So if you want to have adequate levels of tyrosine in your blood, it's going to be in your benefit to eat higher amounts of animal-based protein. So as long as you're eating an adequate protein intake, somewhere around 1 gram per pound of body weight, and the majority, if not all of that protein is coming from animal-based protein sources, eggs, chicken, beef, fish, whatever, you're going to be consuming adequate levels of tyrosine. So you don't necessarily have to worry about tyrosine. Selenium is also fairly common, especially in eggs and fish and chicken and those kinds of things. So it's pretty rare that you'll have to worry about selenium. Iodine, on the other hand, is it's a mineral and a micronutrient that is very, very It's very common for people to be deficient in iodine. I actually made a post about this exact thing on Instagram just yesterday, where I talked about how any of my clients will be able to vouch that I recommend they use iodized salt on all of their meals. And the reason why I recommend using iodized salt is obviously because that salt contains iodine. Now, iodine is an extremely common deficiency, and if you look across general health, you'll see that iodine deficiency is the leading preventable cause of a lot of disorders such as autism, Down syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. And while obviously that's a huge problem, it doesn't necessarily relate to bodybuilding and physique science. But it is important to understand that your thyroid takes iodine and it takes tyrosine and it takes selenium, and it combines all three of these things, and it uses these three minerals to convert T4 to T3. Now, if you're deficient in iodine, your body will not have iodine to merge with the selenium and the tyrosine, so it will not be able to efficiently increase the conversion of T4 to T3. So we need to supplement with that iodine somehow. Now, the foods that iodine naturally occur in are going to be things like seaweed and kelp. And obviously, those are not going to be foods that we regularly eat, especially on a bodybuilding diet. I have no idea how they taste. They probably taste like complete shit. But in order to remedy the situation, obviously the FDA realized that iodine deficiency is a huge problem. So they thought, what is something that we can put iodine in to make sure that everybody is going to be getting adequate levels of iodine? And the solution to them was salt. And so I recommend that you use iodized salt on all of your meals during a dieting phase, just to give your body the necessary amount of iodine that it needs to be able to convert that T4 to that T3, which will keep your thyroid healthy long term and help keep your metabolism high as you're dieting. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone that we kind of talked about briefly, is also decreased through carbohydrate-focused refeeds, which is something that we can explain with the whoosh effect. If you've never heard of the whoosh effect before, what the whoosh effect is usually if somebody goes through a diet, specifically with first-time dieters, or as the diet originally starts, in the first couple weeks, they'll be making progress, like their body will be burning body fat, but the scale weight will not show any changes. So for example, say someone starts a diet at 200 pounds, 2 to 3 weeks in, they're still 200 pounds, and they've obviously gone through 2 to 3 weeks, and they're wondering, why is my scale weight not decreased? Why is my scale weight not decreased? Well, generally what happens is when the body first oxidizes body fat from the cells, the cells, because of the levels of cortisol, the cells will take in water just to kind of help keep the cells firm. As obviously getting rid of all the fat from the cells is going to be kind of a shock to the body pretty quick. So the cells are going to consume water, and they're going to fill with water, which is going to reflect in your scale weight, as your scale weight isn't going to be decreasing because your body's just holding on to water. So what we generally see in situations like that is someone goes out and they have a refeed or they have a cheat meal or something, and the high amount of carbohydrates decrease their cortisol, which decreases the body's ability to retain water. And they actually wake up the day after their refeed or the day after their cheat meal like 3, 4, 5, 6 pounds lighter, because the carbohydrate increase signaled the cortisol to decrease, which caused the water to rush out of the body. Now, while this is important to understand with something like the whoosh effect, I think it's important to understand that the best way to control your cortisol is to practice some effective stress management methods. There are supplements that you can take to help with your cortisol production, specifically ashwagandha, rhodiola rosea, magnesium glycinate, etc. All three of these supplements have the potential to stimulate the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is the rest and digest state. So when our PNS, or our parasympathetic nervous system, is switched on, our body's more calm and it's more relaxed, and cortisol is less present in that state. So we can use things like ashwagandha, magnesium glycinate, post-workout, before bed, like during times in which our body is generally pretty stressed, to kind of help control cortisol. But the best way to be able to control cortisol is to be able to practice some effective stress management methods. I don't really want to go into some ways specifically on how you can manage your stress. There are definitely different ways that you guys can look up and figure out one that kind of suits your lifestyle the best. But that is by far going to be the best way to control your cortisol. More beneficial than any refeed, more beneficial than any supplement is being able to manage your stress efficiently. So let's get into the physiological adaptations to dieting. So before we understand the physiological adaptations to dieting, we need to first understand the components of a metabolism. So what is it that physically makes up your metabolism? Obviously, you can tell by the pie chart here, there are four major things that contribute to what we refer to as your metabolism. So if you take the sum of all four of these things, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, that is going to equal your metabolism. Now, I do want to preface something here. When I made this pie chart for the slideshow, as you can see, I made all four of these sections kind of even shape. There are certain sections of this pie chart that are more prevalent than others. So this is not a complete accurate representation of what a metabolism looks like. It's not one thing makes up 25%, the other thing makes up 25%, so forth and down the line. And we're going to talk about which specific aspects of this pie chart you're going to want to focus the majority of your attention towards as you go through a caloric deficit and a contest prep, because there are some of these things that we can't do anything about as they slow down. We can kind of minimize them, we can kind of mitigate them, but we can't necessarily get rid of them completely, and there isn't something that we can do about it. But there are some that we can do a lot about, and we're going to talk about those as we go forward. Let me get a drink here. All right. So the first thing that makes up a metabolism is our basal metabolic rate. You're also going to see this referred to as your resting metabolic rate sometimes. So what is your basal metabolic rate? So all that your basal metabolic rate is it's a measurement of the calories that your body needs to keep your body alive at rest. So a good way to describe this is if you were to wake up tomorrow morning and literally lay in bed all day and stare at the ceiling, not eat anything, not move an inch, not move a muscle, not do anything at all, your body is going to burn calories to keep you alive during that time period. And what your basal metabolic rate is it is a measurement of how many calories that is to keep your body alive at rest doing absolutely nothing. So how does your basal metabolic rate change during the dieting process? So one of the components of your basal metabolic rate or your resting metabolic rate is your overall body mass. So if you go online and you do any BMR or any RMR calculator, one of the questions that they're going to ask you is your body weight. And what you can do is if you fill out this resting metabolic rate calculator and you fill out 5'8", 200 pounds, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then you hit the calculate button and it gives you your answer. And then you go through and you fill out that calculator again, completely the exact same, but you change your body weight from 200 pounds to 180 pounds. Your resting metabolic rate is going to be different. So what that tells us is that all of our body mass that we have, whether it is skin, bone, fat mass, lean mass, all of our body mass is metabolically active. So as we go through the course of a diet, our body weight decreases. Even though it's all from body fat, our total body mass decreases. And because all body mass is metabolically active, as our body mass decreases, our basal metabolic rate will decrease as well. Now, our basal metabolic rate will also decrease even more if we lose muscle mass. So just to kind of give some hypothetical numbers, for each pound of muscle mass that we have on our body, that pound of muscle mass requires 50 calories at rest in order to maintain. Whereas I believe, and do not quote me on this, a pound of body fat takes 5 calories to maintain at rest. So you can see If you lose 1 pound of body fat, your basal metabolic rate is only going to decrease by 5 calories. If you lose 1 pound of muscle tissue, your basal metabolic rate is going to decrease by 50 calories. So if you lose muscle mass, that's going to be quite a bit bigger hit to your basal metabolic rate than by losing body fat would be. So one of the most important things that we can do, which we'll talk about in a second here, on how to keep your basal metabolic rate high and as highest as it can be, is to keep your muscle during a dieting phase. So obviously we can conclude that the more muscle we have, the faster our basal metabolic rate was going to be. So how do we mitigate these negative adaptations to our basal metabolic rate? Like I said, with the basal metabolic rate and all of our body mass being metabolically active, there isn't anything we can do in terms of it slowing down. It is going to slow down to an extent as we lose our body fat. But keeping our muscle mass intact is going to be the best way to keep our basal metabolic rate the highest that it can be. And we can do that by smart training and smart dieting. Now, also, as I'm trying to kind of loop things full circle here, having a productive contest prep is going to actually start in your off season. If you have productive off seasons or bulking phases where you're actually building quality muscle mass in your off season, you are setting yourself up in the future to have an easier prep or to have an easier diet. If you put on, say you take a 18-month off season, a year and a half, and in that 18 months, you build 10 pounds of muscle. Remember that I said that each pound of muscle takes 50 calories to build. So what you did by adding 10 pounds of muscle is you effectively added 500 calories to your basal metabolic rate. I don't think that it necessarily works out one-to-one in real life application, but the more muscle that you can have on your frame, the faster your basal metabolic rate is going to be, and the faster that your basal metabolic rate is going to be, the more food that you'll be able to eat during your prep and still be able to have some fat loss. So by having productive off seasons and building tons of muscle in your off season, that's going to set you up to have a productive contest prep. Likewise, keeping your muscle mass through good training programs and a good diet through your prep is going to help keep that elevated BMR as high as it can possibly be as you go through the diet. So that's just one component. I would say overall, this is probably maybe 15 to 20% of the total equation here is your basal metabolic rate. But I'm going to put a little asterisk by it. But if you lose muscle mass during your diet, this can become quite a bit more significant. Thermic effective feeding, the second portion of your metabolism. So what is it? The thermic effective feeding is the energy that is required for the digestion, the absorption, and the elimination of your food. So here is how I'm going to describe this to you. When you eat foods, say you eat 100 calories from carbohydrates, as we can see, the thermic effect of carbohydrates is anywhere from 5 to 15%. I'll just take the middle ground here and say 10%. If you eat 100 calories from carbohydrates, it is going to take 10% of those calories to digest the carbs, absorb the carbs, and then eliminate the carbohydrates. So even though you're consuming 100 calories from carbohydrates, 10% of 100 is 10 calories, which will leave you with a net of 90 calories. So even though you're consuming 100 calories from carbohydrates, your body is really only storing 90 of those because it has to burn off the other 10 in order to digest, absorb, and eliminate the food. Now, as you can see, protein is quite a bit higher, anywhere from 20 to 35%. Let's take a middle ground here and we'll say about 25%. If we eat 100 calories from protein, our body has to burn off 25% of those, which in this case would be 25 calories, in order to digest, absorb, and eliminate the protein. So even though you eat 100 calories from protein, the net equation leaves you with 75 calories because 25 were burnt off for digestion, absorption, and elimination. So we can see the more food that we are eating, the higher our thermic effect of feeding is going to be. So how does this change during the dieting process? Well, obviously we're going to be eating less food, and the less food that we eat, the less thermic effect of feeding that we're going to have. And what is the number one way when we hit a fat loss plateau, in order to speed up that fat loss plateau, is to continuously decrease our calories. So as we decrease our calories, now we're eating less and less and less food, which is going to take our thermic effective feeding portion of that metabolic equation lower and lower and lower. So how do we mitigate the negative adaptations to thermic effective feeding? Again, this is something that we don't really have entirely too much choice on. Eventually, our calories are going to have to be at a certain point in order to facilitate fat loss. So as our food gets lower and lower and lower, we can expect that our thermic effective feeding portion of that equation is going to decrease as well. One of the things that we can do to sort of mitigate this problem is actually increase our protein intake as our carbohydrates and our fats decrease. And this is something that if you go back and you watch old Jay Cutler videos, Jay Cutler was working with Chris Aceto for his Olympia run. And then this is something that was also brought to my attention from Matt Jansen's USA prep in 2018, I believe, where he talked about how he was increasing his protein as he was decreasing his carbohydrates from his diet. And what that will actually do is based off of the numbers from above, is if you take, say you're eating a diet that's zero fat, say it's trace fat, you're really pushing 200 grams of carbs and 200 grams of protein. But if you change the ratio to, let's say, 150 carbs and 250 grams of protein, now, first of all, the caloric intake is going to be the same. Either way, you're going to have 1,600 calories between those two, because there's 4 calories per gram in a gram of carbohydrates, and there's 4 calories per gram in a gram of protein. So 200 carbs and 200 protein versus 150 carbs and 250 protein are both going to equate to 1,600 calories of total intake. But in the second equation, because the protein is higher, we're actually going, the net of both of those equations, the one with the higher protein is going to be quite a bit lower. So this is kind of where obviously calories in versus calories out is extremely important to nutrition protocol. It is the number one thing that determines whether we're gaining fat or losing fat. But I do believe that there's more to it than that. And I think that there are ways where we can eat 2 diets, and even though both of these diets kind of have a similar caloric intake, one will facilitate fat loss better than the other. And I think that this is kind of a situation like Jay Cutler and Matt Jansen were talking about, is where we can increase our protein and therefore increase the thermic effect of feeding, and therefore kind of increase our metabolism while not necessarily making a decrease in calories. Now, we're getting down into the last 2 things here that make up the metabolism. First things first is EAT, exercise-based activity thermogenesis. So what is it? Very simply put, this is the amount of energy that is burned during exercise. How does this change during the dieting process? If you remember going back to my basal metabolic rate slide, I talked about that the number one way to keep your basal metabolic rate high is to have a smart training program. And the overlying premise that I'm trying to get here by having a smart training program is you need to maintain your performance and you need to maintain your strength in order to maintain your muscle mass. If say you're benching 275 pounds in the off season and you get so weak during your diet that now you're benching 225, like, those muscles do not have a reason to stay. You need to be able to be just as strong during your diet as you were in your off season, or at least as close to it as you can possibly get. I understand that there's going to be a point in your contest prep where you're so depleted and you're so down in digging. You've dug such a grave that it's hard to be as strong as you were in your off season when you were eating tons of food. But you need to try and keep the drop off as low as you can possibly get. Now, in order to maintain your performance and your strength, you will have to decrease the total volume. So, for example, we've seen some research that shows that you can decrease your volume up to 66%. As long as you maintain the intensity, your muscle mass will stay. So how does this work in real life applicational scenario? So let's say in your off season, you are doing 9 sets of chest per week. Okay. Like 9 sets of chest per week during your off season. You can drop that volume as low as 3 sets per week during your dieting phase. Remember, 3 sets would be 33% of the original 9, which would further validate the study of 66% decrease in volume. So you can drop your volume as low as 3 sets per week and maintain the muscle mass in your pecs, assuming that the strength and the performance is maintained or as close as it can possibly get. Now, as you go through your diet, you're going to be eating less food. You're going to be doing more work, whether that be through cardio or steps, etc. And so your recovery capabilities are going to be less and less. So when your recovery capabilities are less in a diet than they were in your off season, in order to maintain that performance in your strength, you will have to decrease the total workload. So how am I wrapping this all back to the metabolism equation? Well, obviously, if you're doing 9 sets of chest per week in your off season, and towards the end of your prep, you're doing 3, say you start your prep doing 9 sets of chest per week. At the end of your prep, you're only doing 3 sets of chest per week. You've obviously decreased your volume 66%. But if you've decreased your volume by 66%, now you're doing less total volume, which is less total workload. So you're spending less time in the gym. And all in all, that means that you're burning less calories during the training session towards the end of the prep than you were towards the beginning. So this is something that it is going to decrease towards the end of the prep, because you should be decreasing your volume in order to maintain your strength. So how do you mitigate this? Unfortunately, this is something that there really isn't a way to mitigate. You can't really mitigate this without adding junk volume, which is obviously not advised, because if you're adding junk volume, all you're doing is chewing into your recovery standards and your recovery capabilities, which is going to put you at a further risk for overtraining, which is going to put you at a further risk for muscle catabolism. And obviously, rule number 1 of a contest prep is to lose all of your body fat. Rule number 2, which is a very, very close rule number 2 to rule number 1, is to maintain all of your muscle mass while you're doing so. So if you have to decrease your volume in order to keep your muscle mass, that is something that you need to do. Do not be stubborn and keep your volume high just because you want to burn more calories. Realistically, the amount of calories that you're burning through exercise is probably significantly less than what you believe that it is anyways. And so do not add junk volume into your training program just to be able to burn more calories, because it's actually going to kind of shoot you in the foot, and you're probably going to lose muscle mass because of that. Now, you will have to make up these calories elsewhere, which is where we get into the final part of the equation, which is the opposite of of EAT, which is NEAT. And NEAT stands for non-exercise-based activity thermogenesis. So this is the measurement of energy burned from all things other than exercise. So this is walking around at work or walking to your car. This is, as you're sitting in your chair right now, you may be like wiggling your toes or wiggling your fingers. That burns energy. Like just sitting here right now, as I'm sitting here right now, you obviously can't see me. I'm sitting here, I'm completely still like a statue, but I'm wiggling my pointer finger. Like this burns calories, okay? Now, how does the dieting process affect NEAT? As the diet gets more aggressive and you get leaner, your fatigue will significantly increase. As your fatigue increases, your NEAT is going to decrease, because your body, again, we're going all the way back to step 1, your body wants to maintain homeostasis. So your body is going to see something like fidgeting or whatever in your seat as unnecessary movement. And so it is going to stop you from doing that unnecessary movement so that you can maintain energy and keep yourself alive. Okay? You have to understand that our body is kind of going through a starvation period right now, and it is going to shut down all processes that it does not believe are necessary for survival in order to try and keep you alive. And so all of the fidgeting that you may do in your desk at work, or all of the twirling of pencils that you may do like in between sets of the gym, like that is going to decrease significantly as you get more and more fatigued from your diet, which is going to obviously decrease your overall NEAT. Now, what's interesting is we've seen through studies that NEAT can be anywhere from 30 to 60% of the total metabolic equation. So if you have a completely like large drop off in NEAT, your overall like caloric expenditure and your overall metabolism is going to decrease significantly. So if we go back to the very first, back to the very first page here, like I said, NEAT. Like I said, like this is each portion of this is 25%. I don't think that's very accurate. NEAT is at least half of this, maybe even more. NEAT is by far the biggest variable that you have to manipulate in order to keep your metabolism high during a diet. So, how do you maintain your NEAT during a diet? Now, obviously, the fidgeting and all of that kind of stuff, that's going to decrease. And you can't just kind of sit there and make yourself fidget and make yourself burn calories. So, what I have found is as the absolute best way to kind of track your NEAT is to track your step count. This forces you to get up and do things in order to increase your step count, which will keep your NEAT levels fairly consistent, at least consistent as what they're going to be. So you may see if you do a diet with me that I have your meal plan, eat this and this and this and this, but I also need you to get 12,000 steps a day. And that means like at the end of the day, if you have 6,000 steps, you need to get another 6,000 more, because if you only get 6,000 and I tell you to get 12,000, your caloric expenditure is going to be a lot less on 6,000 steps than what it would be on 12,000 steps. And if you're doing that for multiple days, like those are, that's caloric expenditure and a caloric deficit that we're missing out on. And so I have found without a doubt that tracking your step count is going to be the number one variable that you can use to kind of keep your NEAT consistent and keep fat loss more predictable, especially towards the tail end of a diet. When you only have so little body fat left to lose, you need to be able to keep everything consistent and disciplined so that you can get that body fat off. I have found from my personal experience that NEAT is significantly superior and from burning calories and keeping energy levels predictable than traditional steady state cardio. I have not done, with the exception of rest days where I do like 30 minutes just for the purpose of the health of my heart and the health of my cardiovascular system. I have not done traditional steady state cardio with myself or any of my clients once this entire year. All that I have done is I have told them to just track their NEAT and hit a certain amount of steps. And when the fat loss isn't continuing from there, I just increase their steps. Maybe I start them off at 10,000 steps a day. And then if they need to burn more calories, instead of getting them on a treadmill or a step mill, I just increase their steps from 10,000 to 12,000. And it is not only more effective at burning calories, it is less time consuming, less monotonous, and it's less of a recovery burden, because you have to understand that doing something like a treadmill or a bike or a step mill, it is a recovery burden. That is going to tax your muscles, and you need to recover from that. And towards the tail end of a prep, when your recovery capabilities are very low, you don't want to add something on top of that, which will even further dip into those recovery capabilities. And I don't know many people who can't recover from getting up and taking a walk around their block like that. It's very, very low stress, very, very low impact. And it's good for your mental health too, to kind of take some time and out in nature and stuff and just kind of relax a little bit, especially towards the tail end of a diet when stress is super high anyways. All right. So that was a pretty long video, but let's kind of take some of the conclusions and the takeaways from here. So our body will react negatively in multiple ways during a prolonged dieting phase, specifically a contest prep, both physiologically and hormonally. All of these negative adaptations can be minimized and controlled for to an extent. There are some that we can't do anything about, unfortunately. Excuse me. But it's also important to understand that it's impossible to go on a diet without having some of these adaptations occur to a certain extent. What the goal is to minimize them and control for what they're doing, so that we can have the diet be as successful as it's going to be. Higher protein intakes will yield higher caloric expenditure than lower protein intakes at the same calorie level, due to the higher thermic effect of feeding that the protein provides, which is kind of going back talking about the Jay Cutler and Matt Jansen, increasing your protein as you decrease your carbs and fats. Maintaining your muscle through maintaining your training performance will keep your BMR as high as possible, which kind of reflects back to the point that your training performance and keeping your strength during a contest prep is the utmost priority, aside from obviously getting lean. And then finally, maintaining a strict step count will help offset the negative NEAT adaptations. And remember that NEAT can be anywhere from 30 to 60% of the total equation. So NEAT is something that is, if there's one thing that you need to focus on during your prep, it's your NEAT levels and having a consistent step count, which is going to help keep the caloric expenditure more predictable and help keep the results more predictable. All right, guys, so that was a pretty long video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment and I will get back to you immediately. You can hit my Instagram in the description. And if you have any questions, you can follow me there, send me a DM, anything like that. If you guys like the video, please feel free to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And other than that, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, learned something, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.